This is Deceleration, deceleration.news. We're talking about ecofascism this week with some incredible guests. We're looking at the roots, key concepts, and how it manifests, not just in the manifestos of the white nationalist killers, but in our own organizations, our communities, in the environmental movement that regrettably has birthed many of these concepts. So thank you for joining us. We'll try to take good care of you.
Titan was like most planets. Too many mouths, not enough to go around. And when we faced extinction, I offered a solution.
Genocide.
But random, dispassionate, fair to rich and poor alike. They called me a madman.
There you have the ultimate villain, Thanos, from Avengers Infinity War, musing on his solution to hunger and environmental strain. As you heard Dr. Strange there summarize it, boil it down, genocide. The film platforms real-world arguments and anxieties about the state of our planet and the billions of creatures bound together upon it in these deeply woven networks of interdependency. Among Thanos' solution of mass murder has popped up. This is very similar to what you see in shooter manifestos in various parts of the world today as super-nationalists and racists begin to absorb and express environmental concerns. We can expect more of this as the climate crisis becomes ultimately unavoidable for even these hardcore political conservatives, trending fascists, fascists and white nationalists into the mainstream now and occupying the mainstream of the Republican Party. Among these are ideas popular, regrettably, among environmentalists for many decades. And some of these complaints about overpopulation you'll recognize as ostensibly the root cause of our predicament, or people who may internalize, out of an abundance of love or concern for the world, these other ideas, such as one that this group that we're talking with today identify in their webzine and teaching resources, this idea that humanity is a virus itself. Deceleration recently published the work of this collaborative, these academics using the Marvel's Thanos story to define and correct several key myths that that are helping to perpetuate these eco-fascist tropes. And so we offer this material today, this interview with the generators of this teaching tool, in the hopes that folks will search themselves and be prepared to educate others as well about the dangers of these arguments and their inevitable endpoints of expression. So I'll just say quickly who we're talking with. This is the Anti-Creep Climate Initiative, formed in 2021 by April Anson, Cassie Galentine, Shane Hall, Alex Menrisky, and Bruno Seraphin. April Anson, a assistant professor of public humanities at San Diego State University, is with us, core faculty for the Institute for Ethics and Public Policy, and affiliate faculty in American Indian Studies. Cassie Galentine is a doctoral candidate in English at the University of Oregon. Shane Hall is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Salisbury University. Alex Menrisky is an associate professor of English and affiliate faculty in American Studies at the University of Connecticut, and the author of Wild Abandon, American Literature in the Identity Politics of Ecology. And lastly, Bruno Seraphin is a doctoral candidate in sociocultural anthropology with a graduate minor in American Indian and Indigenous Studies at Cornell University. Deceleration is deeply grateful for their time, their work, and thrilled to offer this conversation. Hold on. I ran across the Anti-Creep Climate Initiative originally on the ASLE, Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. I think the website or maybe one of the social channels, and grabbed it immediately. I was like, I want to republish this. The graphics, the webzine itself looked amazing. Drilling down into the I think it's like myths and misperceptions, and was just so well done. I knew I wanted to use it, and I was so happy that y'all were gracious enough to allow Deceleration to repurpose that or to promote it through our structures and channels and what have you. And I know that there's a play on with the anti-creep climate initiative, as well as this the against the creep, against the eco-fascist creep. There was another publication, right, that this is kind of riffing off of. I wonder if someone can just describe first for listeners what the nature of this effort. I mean, it's bigger than the webzine, I think, though that's large in itself, and the associated teaching materials. But maybe describe that, and then maybe we can get into the origin story of this effort as well, and how you each came into it individually. But does someone want to grab that?
Thank you for having us. We're really honored to be here together, and this is, I think, the first conversation that we've had since the week of the launch of the project. So yeah, it's nice to be all together. But we really were concerned with the ways that when ecofascism gets attention today, it's unfortunately in these spectacular instances of spectacular violence that are assigned to the right, and I think probably more or less correctly assigned to the right. But many of the arguments that they're rehearsing are long-standing arguments that are very familiar to, so-called well-meaning environmentalists, often associated with the left. And so we really wanted to provide a resource for broadly speaking public use that would provide resources for, why these arguments are wrong, but in a fun way, a usable way, a shareable way, one that was relatable, and that helped offer a rubric or kind of a list of ways to identify the creep of this eco-fascist sentiment from so-called right to left. So really across the political spectrum. And that creep comes from, it's both a play on, the idea that eco-fascists are creeps, of course, but also Alexander Reed Ross is against the fascist creep, the ways that rhetoric, isn't just creeping from right to center, it's moving also through leftist spaces. And so the project was born out of that desire for a resource like that.
Yeah, I just in my own work, in my own life, I know I kind of like reflect back on it from time to time, and this is one of those moments where it's like, well, where did I first learn that word? How did I learn this concept? Oh, I missed, I did things wrong for a long time in these other areas, and I know that, like, I was reporting on environmental racism for a long time before I understood, like, very, very clearly what it was, or I knew, or I'd ever even heard somebody use those words, right? And I think this is sort of the same, where ecofascism first popped up for me probably around the time of the El Paso shooting, and that's not very long ago. And coming to understand how it was used, how it was being understood then, and seeing, I think for us, the first thing we wrote about, I believe, on Deceleration, using the term, was in response, where we were observing a vigil in San Antonio. And we were like, okay, mental health, okay, check, guns, check, age restrictions, this sort of, all that. And it took, I think it was the fifth speaker till someone said white supremacy. And that's kind of what we were tuned to listen for. And we heard that. And then this is a whole other channel of that, because the environmentalists here, I'd been in kind of like in some level of argument with for a long time, for those who advance kind of populationist understandings and narratives of the climate crisis, and rejecting that, and explaining my reasoning around institutional racism and colonialism and all that. So this is still kind of, I think, new and evolving, but I appreciate what you said, April, in that these are arguments that are being rehearsed. I wonder if someone can maybe pick up on that this is, as as folks who come out of language arts and rhetoric, what does it mean to rehearse a new a language like this, or just justifications that may be too specific, but
Alex, do you want to speak to that? I feel like your current book project prepares you for.
Yeah, I think this is kind of where my head is a lot. I'm really and this is a conversation, right? As you said, Greg, ecofascism as a term is still hotly debated, and I think all of us here have an agreement on what we kind of mean by it when we say it, but among us, we still kind of are working through it in different ways, and kind of the way I really think about it is, I mean, I'm thinking about it, why the word fascism, why not like eco-xenophobia or eco-nativism or anything like that? What makes fascism a useful word? And so I think about just kind of studies of fascism more broadly and what we can learn from them. And what really strikes me about those studies is that one thing that comes up a lot is that fascism is really hard to pin down ideologically. It's really inconsistent. There are several kind of conventional features, but beyond, it's sort of like we know it when we see it kind of thing, but it's really hard to kind of pin it down to an ideological core. But it is sort of something that most observers and scholars and activists sort of agree. It's kind of the way I've been kind of thinking of it is less as an ideology and more as an effect, right? It's something that happens when sort of like existing kind of cultural elements, for lack of a better word, or narrative elements particular to a given culture, sort of recombine in different ways in response to, in the case of fascism broadly, normally severe economic dislocation caused by global capitalism. And the same thing could be said for ecofascism with kind of an environmental twist to it. April had said a little bit about how, this idea of a fascist or an eco-fascist creep, these ideas creeping from right to left. But I think April and I think both think a little more capaciously about it, and less even in terms of right or left necessarily, as in terms of kind of common cultural constructs that are sort of coming together in certain ways in response to catastrophes. So in the United States, for example, you have a history of white supremacy that's a long history that can't really be boiled down to what we today in the contemporary moment call right and left. And you also have a kind of narrative of like pristine wilderness nature that has a long history that you can't boil down to right or left. And when you combine those two things and kind of say, the people of this nation and kind of its natural spaces are being threatened, in combination, the effects that sort of combination has tends to be to target people of color, indigenous peoples who have, for a variety of reasons over the course of US history, been excluded, and obviously not just excluded, been the subjects of genocide, sterilization, what have you. It's so I feel like I'm kind of far afield from your original question. You'd asked about kind of language. I mean, so the way I kind of think about it is it's not even so much a matter of right or left. It's not, although there are kind of key components of the radical right that are trying to kind of make their messaging more palatable for the left. The fact of the matter is it's only palatable to the left because there are kind of pre-existing cultural dispositions that let the messaging be palatable. Certain ways of talking about nature, certain ways of talking about national belonging, borders, wilderness, race, absolutely, and gender too. A big kind of thing in like eco-fascist manifestos, like the El Paso shooters or the Buffalo shooters, is all about kind of like this idea of natural biological masculine strength. So you have all of these kind of social, not just social norms, but narratives about social belonging all over the place, not necessarily confined to right or left, kind of mobilized, right? Put together, recombined, and mobilized by kind of self-conscious actors on the far right, but also maybe unintentionally by people on the left and center.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm flashing in 1,000 different directions as you describe that. I think, the whole the kind of meme culture of Kek and Kekistan and all that chaos and chaos magic and everything, it all like funnels through channels where they, may have no grounded idea of where things are going, or the accelerationists, right? That we just want to speed this and have this thing. And maybe it's for the lulz on the one side, and that's a lot of the energy that comes out of it. But there are definitely architects as well, right? And who have a very clear idea of where they want it to all of this to arrive. So I wonder if there's defining ecofascism, which we kind of were doing here, if we have a solid idea of how we want to define it in terms of this conversation, in terms of your work, and also maybe describe a little bit of how, just for everybody here, maybe introduce yourself when you come on the mic, because there's so many here, and this will be just an audio story. But if you could describe the origin story and coming to a shared understanding just amongst yourselves, I think is important.
Yeah, this is April Anson, and I think what Alex just said is so important actually to understanding the project and our definition of ecofascism. What we came to through much discussion, and I think still some dissent among us, but our kind of consensus definition was that ecofascism is environmentalism that advocates or accepts violence, one.
Okay,
and then
important.
Two, yeah, very important. And then secondly, and kind of equally importantly, it reinforces existing systems of power and inequality. So, and I think that those two distinctions are equally important, but that definition is really in counter-distinction to how ecofascism, especially scholarship on ecofascism, has largely understood it as mostly a state phenomenon where the state takes ultimate control over individual interests. Most scholarship cites Nazi Germany and the influence of like German romanticism on Nazi Germany as the kind of origin point. And so when Alex is talking about the attention to literary studies or the narrative tropes, I think, today's climate fascism, for lack of a better, more nuanced way to describe that, really challenges the traditional or scholarly understanding of ecofascism, because they're so clearly with these screeds, Christchurch, El Paso, and Buffalo, right? They are clearly, and social science researchers tell us this, that the far right texts are really intentionally creating a echo chamber, and they're really intentional about creating this kind of self-referential intellectualism. But when you read something like even the first paragraph of the El Paso murderers text, right, is so clearly a Western frontier romance. Like, you couldn't understand what he's saying without the lens of the literary, because, and we can even think about the ways that it's a speculative project, right? It's a coming threat. It's always about to happen. So it is a work of speculative fiction, just kind of broadly defined. But then when you look at the nuances of the sentence level work of these texts, you really can't understand them without fiction. And when we pay attention to fiction, we see that it's like, this is obviously much bigger than just a state phenomenon. It's much bigger than just a right phenomenon. And it's like way bigger than the ways that most of, up until very recently, or even really recently, the people that are labeled eco-fascists, whether self-described or derogatorily termed, are in really complicated relationships to the state. So, focus on the story that focuses on Nazi Germany, and not to discount the scholars whose work is impeccable in this area. I think we argue that that's a very narrow understanding, and when we broaden it to attend to the kind of narrative tropes that creep across the political spectrum, we can understand contemporary non-manifestos like these mass murders in a continuum with, so-called population scientists today, which, yeah.
Well, yeah, let me just kind of step off of that, and maybe, I know, Shane, you had talked about kind of like you had a story about kind of like how you came into this project that I know we wanted to get back to, but I'm also thinking that for a lot of folks who are listening, our folks, there's, I watch our analytics or whatever, 1 in 5 are we're bioregionally based, right? So like half of most of our original reporting is going to be like dedicated to a place and the people in a place and our relationships there. But the majority of it, there are folks from all over, and there's folks from academia, and I see them out there, and there's folks from other places, but probably that are familiar with environmental narratives, environmental movements, NGOs, and I'm wondering if we can kind of touch on, you talked about some of these, the history of Western fiction and romance and writing and that kind of thing. Just so people know what we're talking about when we say this is a kind of a continuum. what kind of thinkers and writers are we talking about that if we talk about the roots of environmental ecofascism?
Well, sure. I think for all of us, this lineage is really important for us as scholars and educators. But it's oddly like for the webzine, we start with Avengers Endgame. So the canonical text, the master narrative, is the story of Marvel superheroes fighting Thanos, who is a emblematic and maybe the apogee of an eco-fascist. And that's really where this project started, was a sort of tongue-in-cheek engagement with this ridiculous character who's made Marvel Studios billions of dollars, I guess. And then, in some ways that lineage is really important. That lineage goes back to thinkers and organizations. The Sierra Club's attempted sort of takeover by anti-immigration and green, so-called green nativists, Numbers USA, those organizations. From a literary perspective, you can go back to some of our a lot of environmentalists closest held heroes of Teddy Roosevelt, Madison Grant, even Henry David Thoreau and John Muir in respects. So that's really important. And if you take classes with us, you'll often learn about those figures. But the webzine was this attempt at engaging with popular culture that was reaching in just uncountable number of people and circulating really broadly. And so, as much as that literature really matters and is read and uptake, it's the way it spreads around, the way those ideas get repurposed, repackaged for a good villain, a villain who has a sympathetic side, because we do recognize, everybody recognizes that there are these massive environmental crises. But how we respond to the crises is really the most important thing. And I think my own sort of pathway into this work is that I started researching with the assumption that, our response to climate change, our humanity's response to climate change as individuals, as collectives, as nations, as armies, might be far worse than the actual changes to the climate itself. And so how do we respond to that? And I think all of us in different ways have come to this, as April called it, climate ecofascism or climate fascism, as the fascist response to climate change, like the fascist response to globalization in the 20th century, is going to be worse than the heat itself. It is pouring gasoline on the fire for so many of us. And in particular, the populations that Alex talked about, people of color, displaced peoples, those who are already marginalized and oppressed in different ways across the United States and the rest of the world. So
this is the idea of accepting. This is one of the definitions you're working with, the willingness to accept violence as an answer to the current challenges, right?
I just want to throw this out here because it's something I always think about.
Come on, this is Alex Menrisky.
Sorry, I'm Alex Menrisky. Something that I can never get out of my head that I read once was there's another literary scholar and cultural critic, Sarah Jaquette Ray, who wrote about an experience she had giving a lecture at a university, and afterwards she had several students email her so anxious about the climate crisis that they said they would be willing to submit to a green dictator if they would solve the problem. And I'm going to turn it back to Shane, because I think he had more to say about why we did this, what was and who it's for, who we wrote the scene for. But the point being, we have students coming in regardless of whatever political affiliation they might or might not have coming to the classroom. Climate change denial is not popular among Gen Z, right or left. They're all coming into our classrooms really terrified, I think rightfully so. But as Shane said, right, it's really how we respond. And there really is kind of this evidence of kind of mounting panic that leads to statements like that, willingness to submit to a green dictator. And of course, I mean, that's the, as I was saying earlier, right, that's the exact sort of conditions that enabled a kind of a popular rise of fascism in Europe in the 30s. Was a it wasn't just a fringe movement, although the fringe movement gets it started. It speaks to the middle class, you know, because the middle class is freaked out about something or other.
I can jump back in if nobody else wants to. This is Shane again. So I think that, you know, the anxieties that we were facing, we really, I mean, that quote that Alex mentioned there of students being willing to take on a green dictator is a, you know, sort of a dramatic but telling example of what we're trying to respond to with this project. And as a broader like sort of challenge, we're all faced with how do we respond to, how do we take bad ideas seriously? How do you engage with the ideas, the tropes, as April said, or the narratives, the faulty logic, the meme culture for the lulz and the end of the world? How do you do that? And again, our medium became this webzine of treating it as something that is easily disseminated, is very pithy, very bright and shiny compared to our academic work, which is very dull and on Microsoft Word. And the way that we thought was best to do this was to equip people, especially students, with very short ways of recognizing everyday eco-fascist myths, the ways that fascism permeates our culture from all these different well springs, all these different tributaries, and to be able to see it and say what it is, and then have strategies and tactics to refute, rebut, and keep it out of our environmentalism. This project fundamentally was written for people who have a concern with environmental problems and social problems, and yet nevertheless sort of find that even when they know something like, you know, let's build really strong militarized borders to stop climate migrants from swarming the nation, they're like, well, that sounds inherently wrong. But oftentimes when I'd ask my students about why, they'd say like, well, you know, I can't, you know, like there are too many people and they are going to take all of our resources. So I don't want to be mean about it, but ... and that ... is very telling. It means that we don't have a counter narrative and we don't have a way of understanding the fault in the logic of borders or the logic of biologizing our social problems. So that's sort of why and how we did this, and why we hope it's useful for anybody who is concerned with environmental issues.
Can we run through an exercise like that? I mean, can you throw out one of these? I know there's several, right? There's several of these myths and counter arguments or corrections, and I know this doesn't maybe fit into it, but I'm like Elon Musk, you know, I don't know if anybody tracks him on Twitter. You're like watching him these days as revelations of more and more of his kids are coming out. He's saying underpopulation, we're headed for a population crash, and this is the real threat. I mean, I think clearly it's not, right, number one, and he occupies you're trying to recolonizing the Rio Grande Valley down here on the border, and it's like is he just talking about white people that are headed for a crash? Is this, where does this fit? Can you just take maybe one or two of the myths that you treat in this webzine and you know what it is and correct it so people understand what this is about?
I'm gonna tee Alex up here, because I think one of the you know, the most identifiable but also still pernicious, I think, is the population control debate, right? And even with that Musk quote, you see how population is this dog whistle that can function either way, right? It can function, but it's always dog whistling white genocide. So here he's like, okay, so, you know, we're going to recolonize the Rio Grande. Well, first of all, colonists never left, right? Like the settlers are still there.
No, that's my language. So I'm saying my language is he's down here doing this. So that's what native and indigenous folks there. Yeah. Well, yeah, no, he might have spoken to this. He's been accused publicly many times of being basically a colonizer down there in terms of the gentrification that's going on following the development of the spaceport and all of this. But I guess what I'm pointing to is he's got this footprint, right? And where he's definitely having this impact on a particular population. There's a long history of human settlement as well as migration through that area that's now blocked at a militarized border. And he's saying population, you know, the problem isn't overpopulation, it's this coming crash. And I think, so the crash is his, that's his quote. And all I can when I read that, I just think there is an infinite labor supply that's continually moving through the Americas at this choke point, right? That we're sitting on, and he's sitting on. But yeah, he's using it. Thank you for calling it that. I mean, as a dog whistle for a very particular political purpose, and maybe we could. It's easy to jump off of that point as much as any.
Yeah, and one point that I heard actually a couple of weeks after the zine had been released, that I thought, oh man, I can't believe it didn't make it into the zine because it was so good, and I'm going to use this to tee you up, Alex. Which is that it was Jade Sasser, Professor Jade Sasser, geographer, I believe, and she made this point, like even if we were to grant population control aimed at the most consumptive populations, right, which it never is. The United States is a perfect example of why population control doesn't work. U.S. has been in population decline the last 40 years, and consumption has grown. So population control writ large doesn't work, whether it is dog whistling white genocide or a kind of passive ecofascism. And I think but it is the most pernicious, especially for those of us who are circulating in environmental studies. And Alex can speak more to that, I think.
I'll also, I noticed Bruno unmuted too, so I'd actually be very happy to pass the torch to him. But what I'll just say, in terms of, that myth itself, it's not just that time and again a variety of population scientists have kind of disproven this. I'm actually kind of surprised he hasn't come up yet. One of the big figures in the zine and in this conversation in general is Garrett Hardin and his Tragedy of the Commons. He's kind of like the founding father of contemporary population panic, although he's also working in a much older tradition. But the point I wanted to make about that in terms of the myth itself is that typically, population control, population declension, whatever you want to call it, the politics of population is never value neutral, and it normally ends up, these population arguments typically rely on the logic of the nation state and borders to begin with. So typically when people say we need to control the population in the United States, for example, what they're saying is we want fewer brown people coming in here, right? It's always, April, said it perfectly, right? If you want a nice kind of empirical kind of refutation of the population argument, the population has declined in some ways as consumption has risen, the problem with the population argument is that it is often accompanied by other discourses, and that's where it becomes an eco-fascist argument, right? It's fulfilling both of those kind of prongs that April mentioned earlier in our definition. But yeah, as I said, in terms of the myth itself, that's what I'll say about it. But yeah, I'd love to give Cassie or Bruno a chance to speak to this as well, in terms of both the myth and like a rebuttal that we kind of give.
Yeah, so this is Cassie Galentine speaking, and our zine kind of covers 6 of the most common eco-fascist myths that we have noticed or tracked in popular discourse. They're addressed both in the context of the Marvel universe, but also more broadly and how we see them playing out. I think one thing that really got my brain locked in on this project was a lot of the discourse we saw that came out of the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course is ongoing, but so some examples of what we tackle are the myths that we've already talked a little bit about, that overpopulation is an environmental crisis, which we then go to demonstrate through a variety of reaching towards sources by other scholars that in fact is not the root cause of our climate crisis. Another would be that humans are naturally tragically selfish. And so with myths like that, we look a lot to, many years of the dedicated work and activism of Indigenous scholars and Indigenous organizers to sort of counter that concept. The idea that humans are a virus, which obviously became popular in our regular day-to-day discourse with the pandemic. And city people are the problem is another one. So this idea that like the city center is, the real source of this pollution, when in reality, having things sort of centrally located can reduce, consumption or reduce emissions, things like that. We obviously talk about that borders myth. So if we increase the security of our borders, we can curb the use of resources and protect resources. We see that with examples with, I think I wrote a paper a while back on Donald Trump tweeted, I think it was in 2016, about how, immigrants coming across the Southwest border were, leaving all this trash behind and threatening the environment and threatening the lives of Border Patrol, but no mention of the larger, much more structural environmental damage that's done by Border Patrol vehicles and Border Patrol infrastructure. And then the final myth that we tackle is that environmental and social collapse are desirable, right? That we want to speed towards this in order to see what might be on the other side. So those are some of the myths that we tackle. I don't know if Bruno, if you want to chime in on anything else. I kind of just did a very brief overview of the 6.
Well, let's take one of those. I'm reminded, and I don't know if this comes in, but I'm reminded, I just think in general, so just to pull out like the Marvel conversation, just pop culture and where people are at, I just feel like that most people are, my experience is most people are really cool, are really good, are really fun, and are interesting, and I think want to do good things in life, want to be connected and want to help others. Generally, I think that's the impulse. And I think there is an illness, right? A cultural illness that has followed kind of like, and I think in some of the indigenous studies, you'll see, and prepping for some classes, Marisol's got piles and piles of books looking and kind of in the field where y'all are at, looking at, and I've been reading some kind of firsthand account of original peoples in the Americas, Native Americans, responding to the experience of white folks, right? And saying, oh, oftentimes you see reference to an illness or a sickness or this hunger that can't be satisfied, or what this devouring, and there's a counter charge of cannibalism that always followed with the Spanish and others, right? But I think there is an illness in the culture, and it's almost like, even for myself, I know that there's things I'm not understanding or perceiving correctly because I've come up in a certain place in a certain time with certain stories, and it's a challenge, right, to kind of recover from that and to find a really good way to be with other folks. But what I love about this project is that it makes access easy. If someone comes to the point where Thanos is arguing for, destroying, humanity or half of humanity or whatever, and I've been that young person watching a Marvel movie or reading the comics or whatever, and it makes sense, because you do have sympathies, right, for others in distress, for creation in distress, for nature and other species, but a new thought is hard to come by, and I think sometimes it just takes someone, it's like turns a light on. And that's why I appreciate, I don't consider myself an academic. I went back and I did my master's in the middle of all of, it was pre-COVID, but I didn't go that direction. And I have a really hard time reading, honestly, like a couple of pages of some academic work and I'm done. That's what I can manage because can be so dense. But I do recognize the power of a new idea to any of us, right? And so, and a lot of times for young folks who are reached a point where they don't know, they're not seeing, well, what is the answer to this, this where we're at, when the anxieties that we're all experiencing. And so maybe we can take, let's take the, people are bad, right? And so what are the answers that y'all brought forward in this webzine?
Sure. Hi, this is Bruno.
Hey, Bruno.
I'll answer it, I guess, in kind of a roundabout way. But I think, well, okay, I guess I'll just start directly. I don't actually have the zine in front of me, but I want to say, in terms of the way that we structured these mini essays, which again, that mini essays are ways that one could hypothetically respond in everyday life if you hear someone repeat one of these kind of eco-fascist myths or talking points, right? And so I think with the humans are tragically, naturally selfish, something that comes out of the zine is that in sort of multiple sections in different ways, is that a question that the zine asks is like, why do eco-fascist talking points go down so easy? You know, why do they seem so self-evident? And why is it when you hear something like humans are naturally tragically selfish, or humans are a virus, or overpopulation is an environmental crisis, you know, what is it about our social lives and our political systems and economic institutions and the history in this country, specifically the US, and our kind of refusal to like face that history that makes these things seem self-evident. So really the first thing I think structurally in these mini essays, which again are very short, is kind of historicizing and denaturalizing the argument itself. So the idea that humans are naturally tragically selfish has a specific kind of intellectual lineage, and it was articulated by thinkers. I think specifically that one, we point to Garrett Hardin. Maybe someone who's looking at the zine can
right,
agree.
that's the first one. The
Right,
tragedy of the commons.
Tragedy of the commons, right? Like this is something that was written by someone who was a xenophobic white nationalist, and you know, it was an argument put out by him in this century. And similarly, if like we look at the overpopulation discourse, it's like actually there was this person Malthus who introduced this idea in this particular political context. So just
it worked for them at the time. It served a purpose, right? Is what you're describing. It served the industry, or whoever was bringing this forward, right? In Malthus' time, it would be, that we've got a problem with these Irish. What are we going to say about that, right?
Right, and connected to the specific kind of imperial projects of Britain at that time, both in Ireland and elsewhere. So yeah, I can't. Maybe I can tag someone else. I can't remember. I don't want to kind of get it wrong and just riff on it. What else we did say about in response to humans are tragically naturally selfish.
These are stories that served a purpose at a time, and for that reason were carried forward to continue, like in this case the colonial project, right? Or what else? They justified horrendous acts, right?
And they didn't serve good purposes. They served very nefarious purposes.
Yeah, and yet they still live with us because they're, again, harbored. And I think this is something that April said early on this call, that they're harbored by well-meaning folks who, it allows them to be resuscitated. It's almost like they don't die, right, until we just really just nail it right in the heart. So do we want to do that as an exercise, to read through kind of the response to humans are naturally tragically selfish, and maybe even like, when I said humans are bad, I was like, yeah, this actually would have fit. Humans are a virus is the very next one. So is that something we can read through real quick?
I actually think humans are a virus is a good one.
Let's do that. Yeah, we haven't talked about that yet. Perfect. Humans are a virus. I'll read the myth. Does somebody want to kind of bring the reality? So it's structured as, here's the claim, and the myth, humans are a virus, is humans are like a virus or a cancer on the earth. We've probably all heard that. And catastrophes like climate change, COVID-19, are nature's way of defending itself.
The reality that we present in response to that myth, we say, when we assign, and scare quotes, cancerous behavior to all humans, we limit our vision to a recent economic system of resource exploitation. This ignores most of human history, where the majority of human beings have not caused global environmental destruction and climate collapse. The humans are a cancer metaphor was popularized in the mid-20th century by James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis in work funded by Royal Dutch Shell. Lovelock's metaphor mimics fossil fuel companies' climate change disinformation campaigns, covering up the causes, shoring up profits, and continuing to harm those least responsible. The metaphor suggests climate change is nature's revenge, offering a simple cause and effect logic that suggests those who suffer deserve it. As such, the humans as cancer metaphor avoids explicit racism, while it perpetuates harm by naturalizing the vastly unequal impacts of climate change. When we universalize humans as cancerous or a disease, we propagate a nihilism that prevents us from joining the movements fighting for more just and regenerative environmental futures.
Cool. Yeah. And I think, Bruno, you were early on, you said you do work with the Karuk peoples and as you said, up in northern, well, we understand as Northern California. And Alex, you mentioned also that a lot of this work your collective work here is informed by understanding indigenous knowledge systems as well and teachings about some of these issues. So is that an area that's drawn in? I can see that being drawn here, some direct lines to this response.
It's complicated. I do think on the one hand, there's sometimes an impulse to over romanticize, peoples like the Karuk as if they have certain answers to, all of our environmental problems or something like that. But on the other hand, there's, I think settler colonialism and European imperialism globally kind of functions by presenting itself as the vanguard of human thought and knowledge, and by erasing or destroying other knowledge systems and other economic and systems of politics and governance and law, any kind of alternative systems that don't kind of support the kind of racial order and extant forms of wealth accumulation. So it is important to look beyond this sort of self-referential philosophizing that can happen where Euro and Euro-American forms of economy are proclaimed to be inevitable and the only way. And so there's amazing folks to this day all over the world, and definitely here in Karuk country, who are living examples of fighting for to show some of those alternatives. So that's definitely not something we explore in any way, really in any depth in the zine itself, but it's important for us all to be thinking about.
Yeah, and you do reference land back, right? Tactics and strategies as response. I think it's the third point there. And I would say, like, indigenous scholars today, when we even describe climate change, global warming as a crisis, right? That for a lot of folks, and now there's so much attention given to climate anxieties and mental health and all this. There's a lot of people who have lived through, and not just those who identify as Native American, but have lived through genocides, who have lived through kind of end of the world Armageddon and all this other kind of stuff, and have a lot to teach about that. So I appreciate that there are these references here as well. And what about, the tactics and strategies? You want people to be able to access this. I think and it's easy to get into, it's easy to read, but to be able to walk away and really to be able to check the growth or the extension of some of these concepts. So what's the again, kind of going back to the ideal audience and response for this project? Yeah, Cassie.
As a whole, like, most of our tactics are really focused on breaking out of that neoliberal mode of thinking about climate catastrophe that many of these myths depend on. So, like, this idea that humans are inherently selfish or whatever, that is a very sort of individualist approach, right? Like, when in reality, the vast majority of the problem stems from, corporations, the military industrial complex, which is a massive polluter. And so I think we tried to focus a lot of our tactics and strategies to that scale. We definitely advocate for thinking on multiple scales in terms of, like, geography, but I think getting away from this idea that that is presented both on the left and the right and the center, that it comes down to our individual actions, and that's what's going to be the solution. Like, that is what we want to sort of start to stray away from. And I think in straying away from that, we will automatically be sort of countering a lot of these myths simply because they depend so much on this individualist way of thinking.
So much of what we learn from activists on the ground that remind us that this hero narrative is so damaging to movements, right? To this idea whether that I'm responsible for the salvation of the planet or I'm responsible for the destruction of the planet. Both of those, like, are paralyzing, and they exonerate the systems that we know have most of the responsibility. So I think also thinking through the lens of the literary helps. I don't know if this is just for me personally, but it helps me understand my own responses and compulsions as less a measure of my own worth and value and efficacy and morality, and more as like a structures of programming that I am constantly having to engage in. And so I think in some ways that was all triggered when we saw the Marvel universe like let Thanos off the hook completely and let his like very shallow argument stand. And so as I want to make sure that we get into the best part of the zine before we sign off. And I wonder if Bruno can tell us a little bit about the comic, which was basically us trying to imagine, like, what if the characters were equipped with just a small amount of environmental science and environmental research to meet Thanos's shallow arguments and show them for what they are.
Hey, this is Bruno. Sorry. Yeah, so this webzine has 3 parts. The first part is a comic that's kind of a riff and remix and sort of artistic reinterpretation of some of the characters and stuff from Avengers Endgame and Avengers Infinity War, which are the 2 kind of big movies from the Marvel Cinematic Universe that made billions and billions of dollars. Avengers Endgame specifically is like one of the highest grossing films of all time. That's part 1. Part 2 is a series of 6 mini essays with the common things you hear about ecofascism and responses. And then section 3 is responses and tactics, discussion questions, and further readings. And so in the way that the 6 mini essays are sort of like, here's how you might respond if you hear ecofascism stuff in your daily life. The first part, the webcomic, is a little bit of like, in a way, it's kind of a media literacy little primer that uses humor and artwork to have kind of a fun intro to the way that ecofascism creeps into not only our everyday conversations, but also our extremely high profile media and narratives that we as kind of pop culture consumers of the West and globally are kind of taking in. And so I think myself and others kind of came to this funny, troubling realization that Avengers Infinity War is sort of a film that's sympathetic to ecofascism. And I want to back up from that a little bit and to say the villain of the film is kind of an ecofascist. He's not presented as a good guy. His ideology is not presented as something laudable in any way, shape, or form. But he's given a large platform to offer this Malthusian interpretation of the world. And he's presented as a sympathetic character who means well. So even though he's the villain and ultimately he gets killed by all these superheroes, the film itself is kind of sympathetic to him and kind of sympathetic to his perspective. So it would actually be fairly easy to walk away from watching those films thinking, wow, I never really, I'm glad Thanos put it that way. Or people think maybe he made some good points. And when we encounter genocidal maniacs and mass murderers like Thanos in real life, I don't actually necessarily advocate trying to meet them in the so-called marketplace of marketplace of ideas. Or sometimes if people are advocating mass murder and genocide, it's like they're pretty much beyond discourse. They just need to be stopped. And so I think it's kind of good that the Avengers didn't sort of try to win him over, but actually just were like, we need to stop this guy. That being said, the films don't really offer, again, they offer only this closed loop of Western sort of settler colonial eco-fascist thought that sort of marries, various forms of elite power with a very narrow, closed ideas of nature. So it's very insular, and alternative thoughts aren't really offered. And so, yeah, the comic is sort of a fun idea, or it's like, what if as all the superheroes were fighting Thanos and like kicking him in the face and stuff like that, they were also offering these like reasoned, well-researched arguments about why Thanos's kind of whole perspective about, I'm going to kill half the universe and that's going to somehow save everyone's life, why that just doesn't make sense on so many levels. When they never really have that conversation in the films. And and right in the beginning, Thor, I think we have Thor saying something like, he knows his idea doesn't make any sense, we should just kill him properly. And then they end up having the conversation, and at the end Iron Man says, well, so much for defeating Thanos in the marketplace of ideas, and then snaps his fingers, and the film, so the comic ends the same way the film does. But we just wanted to offer that as just kind of like a fun little culture hacking way to introduce these ideas and show how prevalent they are. One other thing I want to say is just bringing it back to fascism generally. It was said earlier that fascism functions by creating popular appeal, and middle classes can buy into fascist ideologies when they feel threatened. I think that's completely accurate, and the historical record shows that, especially thinking about European fascism in the mid 20th century. It's also so important to recognize that fascism succeeds when the elite classes and the most powerful institutions also see a benefit to them by partnering with the fascists. So, in case we know about the Catholic Church, industrialists and capitalists. And so to see, Disney essentially having a little eco-fascist creep, just a little bit of creepage, not too much, but a little, is something that we thought needed to be drawn attention to. And especially in this moment right now, this post 2020 moment, where globally we had Black Lives Matter and protests that were some of the biggest racial justice, biggest protests in the history of the country happening. And now we have this kind of rightward revanchism that's happening nationally. We have to recognize that, again, these powerful institutions do feel threatened by social movements and by the power of people. And that is a moment where they may see it to be in their interest to partner with more fascistic movements and elements. So that's also part of the context of, and part of the intervention that the zine is trying to make, I think, in sort of but also in sort of a fun way, maybe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think well achieved, and so it's also intended to be kind of a check on the film itself, or that let's not leave this hanging. Let's have a direct response. I see. Shane,
can I jump in just quickly to say, Bruno was saying, like, when you encounter a murderous eco-fascist, maybe don't defeat them in the marketplace of ideas, or when the elite align themselves with fascist movements to gain benefit, really, like, in a way that, like, he's 100% right, but it's also the webzine, the ideas, the comic, the essays, the tactics are not geared at everyday people running into murderous eco-fascists in your everyday life. There is that threat, and those foot soldiers of white supremacy who commit mass violence as their own hero narrative within a fascist movement, and in the case of Buffalo and Christchurch and El Paso. But we really, a function of this is to find when your environmentalist board of a local nonprofit, or when your friends in the dormitory are talking about, like, oh, well, we're really just totally screwed by climate change, and wouldn't it be great if a more muscular government came in and decided stuff for us, since we can't seem to decide anything through the democratic process. It's these moments where fascism is creeping and the soil is being made ready, to use more naturalist metaphors that fascists would love, for these sorts of political projects to grow. And so that's really where, it's this webzine doesn't defeat Thanos or his ilk, but it does help us, like you put it earlier, Greg, stop the growth or extension of these ideas into further space, or give people a way to check them within themselves. Because again, Marvel made a sympathetic supervillain because he is sympathetic, and people can find those middle class under threat can feel sympathy. It's not that if you've ever thought that, oh, people seem really selfish, that you are an eco-fascist. That's not what we're saying through this project. But if you are saying that, and you are falling back on that individualist defeatism, you are making things easier for fascism and fascists to take power. And that's what we need to start to understand, and have the intellectual mindfulness and ability to counter that, and then politically to stop it, like Bruno was saying.
Yeah, that's a great. I appreciate that, and I feel like we're kind of in a moment. I wonder if we can just do a kind of around the room thoughts on, one question I have is what kind of feedback y'all have received individually, what kind of response from others who have consulted this and found it useful or not helpful or been caused consternation or whatever. And maybe kind of wrap up with just kind of reflection on what's come from this process and where you hope to go. And we're I'll come back around to Shane and maybe start with Cassie and work on my own little Zoom clock here, if that's okay.
So for the feedback, I guess at this point, I think it's been mostly positive. And we've gotten a lot of people circulating it. I think if we were to like shift our audience, that may not be the case. But I think overall it's been, we've gotten a lot of encouragement from folks. In terms of like reflections, I think something that I've been thinking about throughout this conversation and something I wanted to add here at the end, I think what this scene can do and what I plan to use it for myself is, when the eco-fascist discourse we're encountering in our daily lives isn't always going to be on like Shane has talking to, like on the scale of a mass murderer or on the scale of Thanos who wants to wipe out half the population. It creeps in through things like, for example, I remember like rereading Desert Solitaire and getting to a part where Edward Abbey is just straight up advocating for compulsory birth control for Indigenous women, and like stepping back and thinking, wow, I never like thought about that the first time around. And no one, when it was taught to me, it was taught as this like amazing environmental treatise. And I remember talking to people and being like, hey, like what the heck? And they were like, oh, well, who knows what he meant by it? Like, oh, it's Edward Abbey. And I think something like this zine might have been really helpful in a situation like that, where we can expand our definition of what we think of as violent. Like a lot of people wouldn't think of that, sadly, as we see with the very rapid attack on the rights of people who menstruate, which of course has been happening forever to in particular women of color and poor women, that this violence doesn't have to be mass slaughter. The violence can be forced hysterectomies at immigration detention centers. It can be, which is spectacular violence in my definition of what that would be, but like it can be a newspaper article saying that COVID is good because dolphins are happy, or whatever the discourse may be, or something like that we've seen previously in news coverage. So I think it helps us to sort of expand that definition of violence in a similar way to sort of what Rob Nixon does with his term slow violence, but a little bit more specific to ecofascism. So yeah, I think that has sort of been one of the takeaways for me, is just this, I'm glad to have the vocabulary now, I think, to sort of respond to those texts that are glorified, or those texts that are not quite as extreme or as spectacular as a Marvel movie.
Alex, do you want to?
I'll say something reflective quickly. I think it's something that's come up in conversations with other people before. I just think it's worth repeating anytime we get the opportunity to talk about this project. And it's not really so much about the project itself, beyond the fact that what I'm about to say is essentially, kind of proving the point of the project. And it's that, we're all here. We came together to work on this thing. And, we're all academics, activists too, but academics in the humanities and social sciences. And so much of the work we do is isolated and individual and independent. And we work in an institutional structure that, if not discourages, doesn't make easy collaboration. And if nothing else, it's really nice to have produced something for a wider audience that has already been really well received, and people find it useful and helpful and inspiring, and know that we did that together, not individually. And if nothing else, something that can be said about the project beyond its content is the fact that it's a testament to the fact that the kind of individual hero narrative of social change is garbage, because this was a very worthwhile project, and not one of us would have been able to do it individually.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for bringing that. Bruno, are you can you come in on the?
Shared a early version of the zine with a friend, and he said, this is going to be really helpful for talking to my dad and my family about certain things. And I was like, that's great. And I think we all can think about, I mean, I hear people in my family repeat things that are similar to some of these eco-fascist myths. Humans are like a cancer, or, you know, something, these various things that they get said. Does it mean that those people are eco-fascist? No, not at all. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about this creep. And that's why it's like, it's when it's just creeping, that's when we have this opportunity to have these conversations and to start to introduce some new language, or just to maybe phrase things in a different way for ourselves and for the people we care about. So we can all just start thinking a little bit differently and stem it as it's just creeping. And so for me, just hearing that, I was like, yeah, that's the point. And if he's going to be courageous enough to, you know, push back on his dad in a political conversation, it's like, well, maybe I can do that with my dad too, you know, next time he mentions something about, you know, overpopulation or something like that, just to change it up a bit. So yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. Yeah, I absolutely, and I just say again, I think it's beautifully packaged. It's humorous. I just enjoyed it, you know, and it's easy to work through. That it's not, you know, a labor to understand, you know, like this deep analysis. It's just very, very clear. Here's what's said. Here's where to go with it, and I think it's going to really, like I said, just turning on an idea. Sometimes it doesn't have to be. The more accessible it is, and where you're going with this is accessibility. Then you can interrupt somebody and benefit somebody in their own life trajectory, their intellectual life, their life with real relationships and all the rest. So April and Shane. I should just say one name and not two. Sorry about that. Like, well, do I have a choice?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think the reception has been covered. Lots and lots of people we've heard from have already added it to their syllabi for summer courses and
awesome.
for next year. And I also have circulated it to family that was just recently visiting and spouting some of this stuff, and to be, you know, to be like full transparency, it also helps me catch myself when those thoughts start to creep back in various forms. And I think, you know, all told, just to reiterate what Alex said, is that it's such a testament to how much better thinking happens in community. Like the project is so much better because of all five of us thinking simultaneously about these things. And one takeaway that I personally have gotten from it is Alex's point of thinking of not of ecofascism as a stable ideology, which presents all sorts of intellectual and genealogical problems, frankly, but thinking of things as ecofascist. And just to what Bruno said, you know, that allows us to parse what is a person's identity, even my own identity, and these thoughts that creep in, right? And that helps us be more compassionate and, you know, community forward. And I think ultimately, because it's, you know, it's something that a person that I listen to a lot, Adrienne Marie Brown, said recently was, I want us to live. Like, you know, this is an abundant, gorgeous, remarkable, like shockingly beautiful planet.
Absolutely.
And we have shockingly beautiful politics in a complete, like a myriad of models. And so why would we shortcut our potential and our pasts, like these pasts that we know have presented viable political alternatives on this continent and globally? Because, you know, we should all want us to live. Not to be too pithy about it, but And a huge amount of gratitude is deserved by Melody Keenan, who's a recent graduate of San Diego State University, a graphic designer, and she is just incredible. She took this project from our intellectual pursuits to the amazing thing that you have before you. So yes, Melanie Keenan, San Diego State University.
Something that I keep returning to in this project, through this project, after this project is, again, how do we take like bad ideas seriously? And by that, I mean, like, how do you take something that is widely spread, easily soundbited, shareable, memeable, and seductive, and treat that seriously? You know, as a scholar, it's easy, right? Like, I can write a 35-page paper about it that then nobody reads. And so how do you treat that seriously in sort of on its own turf in its own ways? And so in the mix of the internet, I think this webzine, you know, it isn't memes. It is still longer than something that's 280 characters. But it is a sort of our attempt at combating the sort of the seductive logics of eco-fascist thinking, which is everywhere and bounces around and does in its own internal logic make sense and have a kind of seductive quality to it. Once you actually stop and critically examine something from a historical record, a philosophical record, scientific record, or like any of these sorts of angles, it all falls apart. It's all a house of cards. Garrett Hardin doesn't know what he's talking about when he says that there are nations are lifeboats. It's a terrible metaphor, but if you take the metaphor on its own terms, it's really seductive. That's a deep cut. Look at our further reading for the lifeboat ethics thing. And so, you know, this is something I think we need to do, is just learn that media literacy that Bruno talked about, how to stop and critically think and think about the counter scenario, the counterfactual, the actual facts. And yeah, I don't know, and win the competition of ideas.
I had to drop that in the chat because there are I just, you know, I keep going back to, you know, and I know ecofascism isn't exclusive to like white culture or Western white or whatever it is, but it's largely, right, it grows out of these, everything I've heard people, the reference points and the you know, the writers and the I've heard come out of that stream, right? It seems to be, and it seems to be that's where it's living and that's where it's being amplified the most. And so I do, looking forward, and I haven't, and probably because I'm not as well read in that area, but I am thinking a lot about, like, you know what, and also like talking with some of my friends who, you know, they are organizers of color, and just be like, there is a struggle still for white folks in the movement. Like, is this an okay place for me to be sometimes? And sometimes it's not, sometimes it is, but it's got to be a place for all of us if we're going to get through this, rather than, you know, start parceling people out into our own rooms, you know, and chambers and what have you. So it's a challenge to all of us, really. But the attraction, the allure, I think is mainly in these same places where the accelerationists are living, and the Nazis and everyone else. So y'all, have just enjoyed the conversation so much, and I know we've got a hand up, and I'm not trying to shut it down, but I do. This has been wonderful, and if anybody wants to drop a final thought, bring it in. I saw April's hand up.
I just want to add, this is April, is just that you know, just a plug basically, that what we know from the zine and from our historical and contemporary scholarship is that, you know, whiteness is also a fiction. White supremacy does not need white people. It's a set of extractive property relations. That's a little bit redundant, right? So when we think about this, debunking these myths with the realities and equipping us with these kind of critical reading practices that Shane was so eloquently speaking to, it's about recognizing the performance of those relations and halting them. And so that is a project that all of us can engage in, though differently, right? Depending on our subject positions. And so just as it's a plug, that's a point that has been made by a number of recent scholars, but most compellingly by Joe Lowndes and Dan Hosing in their recent book. just thinking about these, alt-right movements like the Proud Boys being led by people of color, what that means for our ideas of whiteness. And I think thinking of it as a fiction, recognizing it as a fiction that has material effects helps us do that. And the zine is in that spirit.
Excellent. All right. Well, Cassie, Alex, Bruno, Shane, April, with a lot of gratitude, a lot of joy. Really appreciate this effort, and I look forward to seeing it flourish and spread, and seeing where y'all take your work. So please stay in touch.
Thank you, Greg.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
You can find us at our website, deceleration.news. If this has been helpful, it was a joy to produce. Stop by our Patreon, Deceleration. What is that? Patreon.com/deceleration. And, leave $1 or $2. And sign up for our newsletter over at our website. Have a great day. Thank you. And also a lot of thanks to George Garza Jr. for the theme musics. Gorgeous.